This is Orsi, official old guy at oldguytalkstome.com, a podcast dedicated to helping older guys create kick-ass lives for themselves and those that they love. It's for women too. Each week, I bring you a special guest to help you create that life that you imagine for yourself and those that you love. We talk anti-aging medicine, personal growth, relationships, and sex, vices, and other topics that many don't want to talk about but need to. Just because you're getting older doesn't mean you have to be old. Also, if you want to know 3 ways to get laid more frequently without begging, go to oldguytalks.com and opt in. When you do, you're going to get my informative video on 3 simple things you can do to get laid more frequently without begging, so you don't have to turn in your man card. And ladies, you may want your man to know these things, because I think you'll like it too. Additionally, you'll be notified weekly when a new podcast episode is ready for you to consume. Periodically, I will share with you other stuff that will help you create that life that you want for yourself and those that are important to you. Don't want to miss anything? Be sure to subscribe, share, and review this podcast.
Hey there, Old Guy Talks to Me fans. It's your buddy Adam from Podcasting Business School, where I teach podcasters how to love their show like a hobby, but build it like a business. If you're looking to monetize your show and go from having a podcasting hobby to being a podcasting pro, check out Podcasting Business School. You are listening to the Old Guy Talks to Me podcast. Here is your host, our favorite old guy, Orest, the old guy.
This is Orest, the official old guy at oldguytalkstome.com, a podcast dedicated to helping older guys create kick-ass lives for themselves and those that they love. And sometimes creating that kick-ass life has to do with, well, educating people the things that they may not normally know about. They kind of maybe hear about it peripherally, but they may not know about it. And I've got today on my program Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, MD. He happens to be my physician, but he can't talk about any of that because we got all these HIPAA laws and things like that. You have to sign that HIPAA agreement at Costco to get your glasses. That's really important. Dr. Jasser is the son of Syrian immigrant parents who fled the Ba'athist oppression in 1966. He is a physician and a former U.S. Navy lieutenant commander and the president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, a Phoenix-based counter-Islamism think tank founded in 2003. He's also the co-founder of the Muslim Reform Movement and the former vice chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, appointed by the U.S. Senate from 2012 to 2016. Zuhdi is an internationally recognized expert on Islamism. He is a widely published in the field, featured in many top-tier media, and regularly testifies to the United States Congress on the Islamist global threat and our domestic and foreign strategy. He's the author of a book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam. He hosts a weekly podcast, Reform This, on The Blaze. You can also find him on Fox News as a regular commentator that they bring on. And I'm going to post his contacts and links in the program notes. So welcome to the program, Zuhdi.
Thank you, Ars. It's great to be with you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. So my first question is something I ask all my guests. What is the most important thing you've done today?
What is the most important thing I've done today? I mean, as a doctor, I have to tell you, to me, the most important thing is I hope I've made the lives of the 9 or 10 patients I saw this morning healthier and corrected any symptoms they've had and made them feel better. Second most important thing is I saw my family before I left to go to the gym and worked out this morning. So those are the 2 things that have been my day so far.
Okay, perfect. And if number 3 was there, it would be on being on this podcast. I know that would have been number 3.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. I'm sorry. We have that at the end of the podcast. I'll say that.
So, you founded this organization called the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, and when you go to the website, the tagline is "Leading the movement to bring Islam into the 21st century." What does that mean?
Well, we dedicated ourselves to this after 9/11 because we saw so many of the Islamic establishment, the imams, the clerics, the leaders of Muslim organizations speaking on our behalf, and yet they really had no clue about what the West was about. They had no clue about what the source and root cause of terrorism was. And, just like a cancer patient can present with a cough, the problem with Al-Qaeda, with ISIS, and other radical Islamist groups is not just their existence as a symptom. It's not just the cough, it's the cancer. The cancer is that Islam is still a theocracy when you look at its legal systems. Islam as a faith, in its leadership, is still has not gone through a reformation, has not gone through an enlightenment process. It's only 1440 years old. And anyone who's, I think, honest and a Muslim must say that, well, okay, if I'm living in the West, then I must have reformed Islam, my Islam. But you can't sort of then be in denial and say that, well, 1.6 billion Muslims have also reformed their Islam. The Islam of the Saudi family, the Islam of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, of Iran. These are deep-seated, medieval theocracies that treat women as fourth, fifth class citizens, that still have forms of slavery, that still kill gays, that treat other faiths as non-existent, that are anti-Semitic. All these things are part of the Islamic theology, if you will. It's not the Islam that I learned growing up in a small town in Wisconsin, but my parents escaped Syria, as you said, because they wanted to give me and our family better opportunity here. But the reality at our American Islamic Forum for Democracy is we look at the founding fathers in America and say, listen, one of the greatest shifts in mankind in history was the American Revolution, in which not only did they fight for our Constitution and our Bill of Rights, but they fought against the concept of a theocracy, and they fought against the concept of a religion establishing itself through government. And until Islam goes through that process, you are never going to do away with the concept, the supremacism of radical Islamic groups, be it ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood. These are all some of the same symptoms of the same cancer, which is political Islam and the Islamic State concept.
So, I think you kind of explained, but I kind of maybe put it in more succinct terms. What is the difference between being a Muslim and being an Islamist?
Yeah, so, being a Muslim is anyone who practices the faith of Islam, that believes the Quran is the word of God, and I think is part of the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition of the God of Abraham. An Islamist is a political movement. It's a political party that believes that the state gets its identity, not like our founding fathers said, under God, but under Islam. That rights don't come from God directly, but that they come from Islam and the clerics that give you those rights. So the Islamic movement is a party that believes that the faith identity is wedded to the governmental, to the national identity, that the flag is not one for every individual, but rather one for the faith. That's why you have Quranic doctrine on the Saudi flag and on the Muslim Brotherhood flag, and they talk about jihad. I served 11 years in the U.S. Navy. I would die for freedom. I would die for our values as Americans. The Islamists would only die for the Islamic State, for Islam. They don't believe in secular national identity. So jihad to them, their militaries, is about fighting for Islamic dominance, for supremacism. So the difference between a Muslim and an Islamist, like a fascist, like a communist, believes in an idea that dominates the government and the legal system, which is political Islam and Sharia law. A Muslim is a person that believes in personal practice. So all Muslims are not Islamists, but all Islamists are certainly Muslims. So if you're going to defeat political Islam, you're going to need to engage Muslims to do that. Non-Muslims can't beat the theocracy of political Islam.
Yeah. Why are Islamists so resistant to change, to the Reformation, as you put it? What's the drawback there from their perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. Why do they behead those that disagree with them? They are power mongers that realize that if you have freedom and liberty and decentralization of ideas, they will lose power, they will lose finances. And that's why Ultimately, it's about money. It's about corruption. And they have used the faith in their robes and their beards to invoke fear in others and prevent, if you will, free thought, critical thinking. They're afraid of modernity. They're afraid of the 21st century and what it may bring. And ultimately, for them, it's about control. So they say that you are not Muslim. They say that our Muslims and our Muslim reform movement are not Muslims. We are apostates because we reject the authority of the Islamic State. And, you know, to me, this, if you look back in history, it's always been a battle between the revivalists or the literalists that look backwards and the reformers and the modernists that look forward. So the reactionaries, if you will, that don't want any change into faith, that are literalists, that say, well, if God said cut the hands of those who steal in the Quran, so therefore you must chop their hands off. Or if God said, do not befriend the Jews and Christians, then that must be what they mean. When in fact, the interpretations can be made in a way that the translations are poor, they need to be modernized, and they need to be separated into religion versus history. So there are some aspects of the Quran that are not literal because they are related to the 7th and 8th century, not related to the 21st century. But to the literalists and the power mongers, that's their way of controlling the religion, is saying, this is what the scripture says, you can't change it. And you know, you and I can talk about what are the key aspects of reform that need to happen. But at the end of the day, it's all about control. You know, clerics that reside themselves to just the ivory towers and stay there and don't control government, they're not the threat. The threat is really those that want to influence governmental law and legal systems and structures based on Islamic doctrine.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, some of that, I think you see sometimes some of that creeping in here a little bit in the United States in some areas. Is that correct?
Oh, in the West, I mean, in Britain, for example, you've got 80 to 100 functioning Sharia courts. And in the United States, we have a long tradition of a separation of church and state, or mosque and state. And thus, on the one hand, the arbitration system, such as the Beit Din courts of the Jewish community, or the separate arbitration systems in the Catholic Church, etc., that's a part of liberty. But the problem is we as reformers say, listen, fine, you can have religious liberty, and we don't want the government running religious courts as you have in certain societies that exist. But those courts need to adhere to 21st century respect of the equality of men and women. For example, I can give you tons of examples where women have come to the imam in their mosques and said they're being abused, tortured by their spouse, that there's female genital mutilation and other things happening to the kids. And the imam tells them, well, work it out on yourself, by yourselves, and don't tell the authorities, etc. So it sort of shows you that some of this stuff needs oversight. And the courts have ruled in the United States, as much as we believe in separate and independence of religious arbitration systems, if you're a polygamous cult, for example, as we saw in northern Arizona and elsewhere, those get broken up by the feds because it violates core human rights. It violates the respect of certain values that are part of our Constitution. So therefore, independence does not then trump the ability to respect equality. And that's why we've been trying to call to open awareness about these religious courts that sometimes have been incubators for radicalism. And the government has not been doing, I think, the oversight that should exist. And that's why now 26 states have laws against female genital mutilation that's done to 7, 8, 10-year-old girls. And we're trying to make it 50 states, but believe it or not, it's not in 50 states because actually both, not only the far left, but some of the far right are concerned, and understandably so, they're concerned about infiltration of government into private religious matters. But hey, this should be a no-brainer.
Yeah, there's so many issues on the gender that we can go into, including the puberty reduction, and that's kind of like the puberty stoppers, which is just totally insane as far as I'm concerned. But let's talk about the threats around the world, especially is in Europe. I mean, it seems like Europe has been overrun by a lot of these very violent people, and mostly from Islamist Muslim countries in the Middle East.
That's a great point. And actually, I have a piece coming out in the next week or so with the Center for Security Policy that I'm a fellow for, talking about that Americans need to pay attention to what's happening in Europe. If you look, Austria had an attack in November of an ISIS adherent that killed 4 people, injured 23. You had in France the beheading of a school teacher in October that basically did the crime of educating his middle school students about what happened in their country in 2015 at the Charlie Hebdo magazines, where 14 people were killed by ISIS because the magazine simply published cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, which, you know, Macron now in France has almost had daily speeches talking about the need to confront political Islam. And he's talking about the need to confront the threat of the insurgencies that exist from immigrant populations. And boy, there is a cultural battlefield now waging in France and Austria and Germany. The EU met in a summit in December, just a few months ago, in which they said, we are going to now hold no bar in confronting the threat of immigrants that carry the ideology of political Islam. Now, even Austria, I think, went too far. Sebastian Kurz, the chancellor in Austria, said in a tweet, and now as part of legislation, he said that it is now criminal to harbor the idea of political Islam. They're realizing that these mosques and other institutions that are Islamists are threats because they don't adhere to Austrian values, Western values of secular democracies, and as Macron called it, small r, Republican values of the Republic, of their laïcité policies, which is the belief in a secular equality of all under the government, under the national identity of France, but not under Islam. So the radicalization process that's happening, and remember, their population of Muslims is much more than in the United States. In France, it's almost 10% of their population. In Austria, it's 2-3%. Now that has grown quite a bit in the last generation. So what happens is, until they start to confront this, they're basically been ignoring the separatist idea, and you're starting to see a lot of the word separatism coming up because Macron has talked about in France de-ghettoizing the Muslim community. Kurz has talked about confronting Islamic separatism because they come to those countries just to get economic benefit, but not to really embrace being Austrian or embrace being French.
Sure.
And ultimately, Horace, my piece talks about this week that America really has, not only should we pay attention, but we have the solution to this. You know, my parents felt American the first day they stepped off the plane in Ohio. And I grew up in Wisconsin, but, you know, when they first arrived in Ohio, they felt American because America is a sort of a melting pot, a salad, if you will, whatever you want to call the metaphor, of folks that come from other countries to be free here and live under our constitutional contract. Now, that sort of immigrant mentality is a little tougher to absorb in Europe because they have more racially based countries. Sure. Now, they've tried to apologize for that by welcoming in tons of immigrants, but they really didn't vet them as far as ideology. So you have a lot of folks that believe in Islamic theocracy coming in and not adhering to their state values of democracy. And thus they have this cultural clash that now they're finally confronting. And if we confront it, I would tell you the solution, this is why we formed our American Islamic Forum for Democracy, the solution to political Islam is Americanism. That I felt that I could practice my personal faith of Islam more freely and more genuinely in Wisconsin in that small mosque than I could in any Muslim majority country because it was my Islam. It wasn't one forced on me by the government or the clerics that controlled our community. And I think ultimately this is what Europe now, I would ask people, look at what's happening in France and Austria. I think that Austria, by criminalizing the idea of political Islam, is actually, they got the diagnosis right, but the treatment's wrong. In America, we've sort of proven, if you look at the Supreme Court case, Brandenburg versus Ohio, the KKK, they said, listen, as long as there's not imminent violence being preached, we're not going to outlaw hate speech. Europe does have laws against hate speech. And I think you can see that they have much bigger problem with hate groups than we do in America, because you can't treat something that you push underground. And repeatedly, Islamic groups have shown they thrive underground and the antiseptic of sunlight is what destroys them, and that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I think a lot of times when you try to legislate stuff, you make people into martyrs and more radicalized because, oh, I can't do that. Of course, just watch me. I'm going to do that.
Exactly.
You know, it's interesting because there's that what you mentioned about going on in Europe, because for many years there was actually, as you mentioned, a denial of what was going on. I mean, you know, Sweden was, you know, it's unrecognizable in some areas, especially with no-go zones in France, probably in Great Britain and other countries. So it's rather kind of amazing that all of a sudden people are recognizing it. Like the government and leaders are recognizing it.
It's interesting, you know, when they were confronted about those zones, they denied them and said, no, that doesn't exist. That's a fable. Those are fictions. That there is no such thing. And yet, Macron, at the top of his speeches in the last few weeks, has been the fact that he wants to de-ghettoize those communities. And if you look, Europe in November 2015 had an act of terror committed in Paris. And then that same cell, two of the terrorists then went to Belgium to commit a second act of terror, even after the first one they did. And even though Interpol and every security apparatus in the EU was trying to find them, they hid from security and now there have been hundreds arrested, and that they retrospectively realized were hiding these ISIS operatives that then committed the second act in March 2016. So you can't be a terrorist that commits two different acts in two different countries and cross borders without being able to hide within some communities that provided refuge for radicals. So, you know, the problem is they have not had ideological filters on folks that they've allowed into their countries. And by the way, most of the acts of terror, even in Austria, which this was one of the first acts of terror they've had in 50 years from an Islamist in their country just a few months ago, this guy was not only in prison in 2019, but he was on the radar of their security apparatus. Almost every one of the ones that commits acts of terror is what, you know, they talk about lone wolves. Now, internally, we talk about known wolves, which are folks that are known to the security apparatus, and yet they let them sort of go about, and many of them go on to commit another act of terror, which tells you that the security apparatus is overwhelmed, but it's also a little too soft on folks that probably should have been left under better scrutiny, or at least left in jail.
Did you know that there are 76 additives that have been approved by the FDA that can be added to wines? You want a wine with shit in it that may not be good for you? Well, there is an option for wines that have been produced naturally, organically, that have been tested, that have no sugar. And when they don't have any sugar, that means that they're ketosis and intermittent fasting friendly. These wines have been produced with a great deal of care on small farms and are available to you. How do you get them? Find out by going to www.oldguytalks.com/dry farms, dry farms, all one word with an S, and find out more. And with your initial order, you can get a bottle for 1 penny. That's right, a bottle for 1 penny. And they taste great. They taste great. Don't wait, don't hesitate, don't procrastinate. Get those wines now. So I want to switch gears here a little bit. We have a new president, and who is influencing the policy, Mideast policy in this administration?
Boy, I wish, you know, I can give you some good guesses. In the piece I wrote a couple weeks ago, I talked about the Trojan horse that is the Biden administration. And what did I mean by that? Well, you know, it's interesting. Biden supposedly sold his campaign that his movement was going to be a moderate, more centrist approach in the Democratic Party, and they got the progressives and others to sort of buy into that. And now we've seen with his executive orders that he's actually handed the pen over to the far extremes of the Democratic Party. If you look at how much progressivism has passed, and when you look at who they've appointed, you have people like Rima Dodin, who worked for Senator Durban in Illinois, and was one of the liaisons for his office, and has said things that in many ways even excused suicide bombing among the Palestinian community, that apologized for some of the radicalism of Hamas and blamed it on Israel, and worked closely with the Council on American Islamic Relations. You see a number of appointees that seem to, for example, he has an overt lobbyist for Qatar that ultimately now is helping shape their Middle East policy. And Qatar, for those who are unaware, is probably the Gulf state that's the haven for the Muslim Brotherhood, and that has proven to be, through Al Jazeera, one of the main radicalization arms globally for media of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamist movements, if you will. So I'm concerned that ultimately, if you look at their appointees, what they're doing with Iran, they have already signaled that they're giving they already released $1 billion without any authorization to the Iranians through what they said was theirs anyway, that was being held in Iraq, and that should light some concern for many, or as a red flag. Not to mention that they're talking about negotiating with them again, and we're seeing that Iran has begun moving much more quickly towards nuclear armamentation in the past few weeks than they have in any time under the Trump administration, because you can't appease these folks. And yet the folks running the foreign policy, the diplomatic arms for the approach to Iran, seem to be the same apologists, if not worse. And the reason I believe it's even worse than the Obama administration is because Obama sort of came into his administration trying to prove that he wasn't a radical, sort of saying that, no, I don't have anything to do with the Reverend Wright, Louis Farrakhan type mentality and the far, far extremes of our party. And he tried to prove that he was more moderate. And he didn't really, I don't believe he came across as a moderate. He did empower the Islamists. Now Biden came in as a moderate and is actually trying to appease the far left and handed everything over to them, and it seems to be missing in action when it comes to any verbal or at least leadership from the days at the White House with press conferences, etc. And we have no idea what's happening. All I know is that they're trying to single-handedly dismantle all of the progress made under the Trump administration with the appeasement, maximum pressure against Iran. Now it's become appeasement, and with the Abraham Accords especially.
Yeah, let's talk about the Abraham Accords. When that happened, that was pretty significant, and it seemed like more and more countries in the Middle East were getting on board with I guess it would be an accurate term, normalizing relations with Israel. What do you see as the future of the Abraham Accords, especially with countries like Saudi Arabia that still have not signed on?
Yeah, I think it's going to go down in history as one of the most significant shifts in from instability to stability that we had in the Middle East. And the reason for that is, on the one hand, it was sort of natural because the Obama administration had so alienated. Remember, after World War II, there was a shift in the Middle East to which America and Europe became allies or solidified their alliances with the Sunni Arab monarchies and dictatorships.
Right.
So that was sort of our, it was Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and sort of the Arab monarchs, if you will, of the Gulf and Qatar, and we have bases all over there. Russia, on the other hand, and during the Cold War, became allied with Iran, Syria, the Shia of Lebanon, and Iraq. Well, not Iraq. Iraq was sort of in the middle there, and that's one of the reasons the Iran-Iraq war went on so long, and we fueled Saddam Hussein. Then comes the 21st century, 9/11 happens, and we sort of reshift as we start to take on radical Islam and the viral component, and Obama shifts us to being simply pro-Shia, and Russia sort of was forgotten about, if you will, and we abandoned a lot of the old allies that way. Now I, as somebody whose family escaped Syria and am no fan of any of the dictators, in my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, I talk about why America's 20th century foreign policy, which was that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, if you will, that policy to dictators in the Middle East was a huge disaster. And I was glad to see that come to an end, but not the way Obama did it. So having said that, what's different now is the Arab awakening. remember, the Arab Awakening happened in 2011. And after the Arab Awakening, we thought, oh, okay, there was going to be revolutions and we were going to have democracy sort of ushered in. And then we sort of woke up to the reality that there were no institutions in these countries, that the people were left pretty corrupt after generations of being run by dictatorships. So there needed to be a little smoother transition over time. So that transition, we realized, needs to come slower, but maybe not as slow as the monarchs and the dictators want it to come. So somewhere in between is the reality. So Trump reset that and said, listen, he was going to say to the Arab leaders and the Sunni leaders, especially in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, we're back with you. We want to be with you, but you need to recognize Israel. And that recognition of Israel, I think, has become much clearer, not because it's done simply for utilitarian sake, but because they have the clerics back that up. In Dubai, for example, in the Emirates, they have had clerics from the pulpit say why the Quran and we as Muslims should be able to defend the existence of the state of Israel. We've never seen that type of theological reform coming from the pulpits. And we've seen in Bahrain similar theological reform when it comes to the peace with Israel, which also is taking out of the equation this concept that was so enmeshed in the State Department, Oris, that somehow you had linkage, that if you solve the Palestinian crisis, that you would then solve everything in the Middle East, which was complete nonsense. And now you see they're starting to exaggerate the problems in Kashmir because they've lost the ability to hook the Palestinian issue on every Muslim on the planet. So now they're trying to hook the Kashmiri issue on every Muslim on the planet. So this is, I think, one of the big advancements. Saudi Arabia, I think, will come around, but they're a little more dogmatic in their theology with the Wahhabis. So it's going to be tougher for them to do away with some of their anti-Semitism. That's part of their history, if you will, but they have met with Israel, and I think that will make it a much longer lasting relationship, and possibly will move, as you take the Palestinian radical equation out of it, I think you're going to find more openings for other reforms down the road.
Yeah. Now, weren't there joint military exercises between Saudi Arabia and Israel, if I remember correctly?
Yeah, and the reason that's important is, remember, the biggest threat right now to stability in the Middle East is Iran. So whether it's pragmatic or whether it's pragmatic or theologic, one of the things the Biden administration did that was just complete insanity, Oris, is 2 weeks ago they said the Houthis in Yemen, which is a Shia radical terror group, they delisted them as a terror organization. So Biden, within a few weeks of taking office, delists the Houthis. And 2 days ago, his State Department folks are giving press conferences about, oh, we don't know why they're slaughtering civilians. This is really uncalled for. And we didn't, and some of the reporters that are at least awake in that room are asking them, well, why did you guys delist them? And they didn't really have an answer for that. They said, well, you should ask the State Department or ask whatever. And they don't really want to take ownership for that. So, the Houthis, just for information's sake, are a Shia radical group, no different than Hezbollah in Lebanon or in Syria, that are basically funded, operated, and infused by ideology from Iran, from the Khomeinists and the supremacists of Tehran. So the bottom line is as you look at the security of Saudi Arabia and other allies that we have in the Middle East, sure, they're going to be doing military operations together because they have common threats. Israel's threat from Hezbollah is the same as Saudi Arabia's threat from the Houthis in Yemen and also from Tehran.
Yeah. So in all the work that you do, I imagine you get some pushback from your community, even here in the States. What's that like?
Yeah, I mean, it takes on many forms, that pushback. There's, the toughest pushback is probably the social sort of community pushback that you get, where folks that agree with you yet function in ways that is either cowardly or dishonest, and will begin to ostracize, my family, my kids, and others. We've never been kicked out of a mosque, but I'll tell you, people should look at a piece I wrote in 2014 called I Was Bullied Because I supported Israel and because I attacked Hamas. And the bottom line is I was at a Ramadan gathering at one of the biggest holidays as we prayed our holiday prayer. And then the imam went off on a sermon about how there are enemies in America that are against Muslims. And he said, we even have them within our community. And my son, who at the time was 12, elbowed me as he's talking about a doctor in our community that attacks Muslims. And he talked in the Quran about how there are folks that are atheists that pretend to be Muslim and that will be agents and commit treason against the Islamic State. And basically, you know, I wrote in the piece for the Arizona Republic about how if that had happened in Saudi Arabia, that would be a declaration of a death sentence, because it's, you know, I served in the Navy, and if you violate your oath to your country, it is appropriate to then convict those people of treason for desertion and other things. So in the Islamic State, when you say somebody left their faith and left the country, left your community, that's a similar to that. Now, we've never been attacked physically. It's all been verbal. But I'll tell you, these folks that were attacking me were not uneducated. They were physicians and attorneys and others. The person speaking from the pulpit was part of a law firm in town that ultimately, after I exposed what he said and we translated it and posted on our website, he no longer works at that firm. But, you know, it sort of shows you that as you expose them for what they are, ultimately they will back down because they don't have the truth on their side, and bullying and intimidation just does not work if you stand up to it. But, you know, God bless my wife and my kids for putting up with it. Sometimes I'm sure they say to themselves they didn't sign up for this. But, you know, listen, we have family, Oris, that are miles away from chemical weapons attacks every month or so in Syria. And there have been 600,000 that have died from trying to fight the Assad regime and against ISIS and others. And, you know, since that revolution started, my family's been like, boy, we are so blessed to live here. And this is the least we can do, because we can do things in America that if I was doing this work in Cairo or in Damascus or in Tehran, I wouldn't last a week and I'd be in a jail cell somewhere, not to mention if I was even alive. And same thing for the rest of my family. So, you know, I think ultimately, if you look at most historical reform in religions, the Enlightenment process, the 30 Years' War in Europe, in which Christianity went through some major seizures, if you will, of change, killed 8 million people in 30 years. So, you know, ultimately, I think this is sort of the process in Islam that we're going through right now. It's going to be pretty bloody. And if those of us living in freedom can't take the time, the energy to do this, and I can tell you, as we talked about at the beginning, right, I think the people making money from religion are not going to be the ones that solve this problem. They never are. The clerics whose paycheck depends on keeping their paycheck with the zeros behind it that they have are not going to reform the religion that gives them power. While those of us that make money doing other things, like seeing patients, being a doctor, doing other things, and we do this because of legacy work, I think are going to be the ones that ultimately will need to reform and lead this movement.
Yeah, I think the tying into the paycheck is kind of interesting. And you would know this better than I do, but I had read or heard somewhere that a lot of the problems with the Shah in Iran started after they cut off the clerics' paychecks. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And that's why, you know, to me, if you look at Western democracy, most of the fruit of Western democracy came from multiple revolutions. And, you know, many have criticized, I was very critical of America's relationship with Mossadegh and others in which our intelligence propped up the Shah. And listen, there's no argument with the fact that the Shah was a better option for us strategically than the Khomeinis and the Islamic Revolution have been, which are a 100 times bigger threat to us now than the Shah ever was. However, if you look at political Islam as a cancer, if Iran finally is able to get rid of the revolution, the Islamic clerics that are in robes and beards that are destroying their country, Iran has the largest atheism conversion rate to atheism of any country on the planet right now. So as Muslims realize that the theocracy is destroying not only their country, but their religion, I think they will then begin to, you know, sort of like treating a cancer. Sometimes the patient doesn't survive chemotherapy, but most of the time they do. And then they come out of it clearer and better and cancer free. So just like Syria needed ISIS to get out of its cauldron that Assad and that whole situation created. They still felt freer fighting Assad than they did before ISIS came out. So sometimes you have to get sicker before you get better. And I just think we need to pull our troops out of the equation. We've always felt that we needed to send American troops everywhere to solve these things. And I think we realize, let these countries solve it on their own. Keep the foreign interference of Russia, China out of it if you can. And ultimately, they will go through revolutions 1.0, 2.0 to 5.0. And ultimately, I think it'll take hold of what every people want, which I believe is secular democracy. And Iran now post Khomeini will not go back to a monarchy dictatorship and also never go back to a theocracy.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you because this is enlightening, a little more in depth than we get on the 3-minute clip on the news in terms of an overview of everything that's going on and the work that you're doing, and you're doing incredible work, and I wish you the best, and thank you again for coming on the program.
Thank you for all you do and letting your following be aware of the work we do. Find us online at AIFdemocracy.org, AIFdemocracy.org, and also our MuslimReformMovement.org. And catch my podcast if you can at Reform This.
Okay, and I'll put all those links in the program notes. This is Or's the official old guy at oldguytalkstome.com. Remember, it's all about creating a kick-ass life for yourself and those that you love. Until next time, thanks for joining me on this podcast. If you like what you heard and learned, then be sure to do 3 things. 1, subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. 2, share this with someone who may need to hear it also, and it may be your significant other. And 3, review it. Give me a good review. If you didn't like it, give me a bad review. I don't care. Just review me. And be sure to get my free video on 3 ways to get laid more frequently without begging. Opt in at oldguytalks.com. Don't be that guy that just takes in the information. Take action. Without action, you're not going to get the results you want.